Does anybody need a sheet? It'll be 11 through 13 of Nehemiah. Anybody need that? You'll attend to that, please. Raise your hand good and high. May I say, Joe, it's good to have you back. Prayers have ascended for you. You getting your strength back? Still weak. And David, good to have you and Jeannie with us. I saw a car out. Okay, we're in we've covered the book of Nehemiah. I'm not going to say a lot of review. We'll let the questions review us on our 13th chapter here, which is the final chapter. And Brandy, I don't remember, did you take one? Okay, so we'll start with Brandy, and we're on the sheet that says questions on Nehemiah 11 through 13, and we're taking up with question number 18, which is the beginning of Nehemiah chapter 13. Brandy? Number 2. Listen to me. Number 19 next, please. Jason, would you like to take that one? Okay, Nathan, it looks like we're passing to you. And go ahead and read to the tail end of it.
However, our God turned the curse to a blessing.
So that's the answer to the question, what had God done about Balaam's efforts to curse Israel? The text says God turned the curse into a blessing. In other words, that's where the Spirit of God took over, and though Balaam was putting himself in that position to bring when we use the word curse, it doesn't mean like cuss or use profanity. We have to understand this is referring to a prophetic curse from the standpoint of a call for calamity, a call for defeat upon an army is the idea. And God turned the curse into a blessing. Number 20 is next.
What was done about the mixed multitude
Okay.
separately?
So this is not so much a racial thing, because actually people of other races could become proselytes. That's what a proselyte is. This is a religious separation. When it talks about the mixed multitude, this is referring to those that were continuing their pagan practices. And that's the kind of people that they separated themselves from. Number 21 is next.
What had been done for Tobiah, verse 25. Now before this, Elisha, the priest, having started with the storeroom of the house of our God, was allied with Tobiah. He had prepared for him a large room, for previously they had stored grain offerings, frankincense, oil, besides the grain, new wine, and oil, which was commanded to be given to the Levites and singers and gatekeepers, and the offerings for the priests.
Okay. Now, as I say, we've covered the book. Obviously, if you're visiting and of course, many that are visiting have already studied this too. But if for some reason you've not already studied this previously, you might wonder, well, who is Tobiah and what's the significance of that? But there was not a worse enemy that the cause of God had at this time. I mean, he was opposing on every possible way, even hiring false prophets. He was doing everything he could to thwart the divine purpose. He was an enemy of righteousness, like Paul said to Elymas in Acts chapter 13 on the island of Cyprus. He's an enemy of righteousness, an enemy of God. But now that the wall is built and things are looking better for the Jewish side, he wants to be on the winning side, and he's ingratiated himself, he's allied with the high priest. It's like, well, here, come on in, Tobiah, and he's just made him a nice, spacious room. Some have even suggested it might have even been a suite of rooms for this enemy of God right there in the temple. The storage rooms, of course, that were built onto the temple is what that means. Number 22 is next. All right, Danny, is that to complete your side?
Yes.
All right. So, Sister Zelda, we go over here to you with number 22. You see, that needs to be said because all the reforms that had taken place. The wall is built in what chapter in Nehemiah? Anybody? Chapter 6 is correct. The book has 13 chapters. Why doesn't the book end in chapter 6? Well, the point is there was more work to be done. And so it talks about what Nehemiah did after building the wall in chapter 7 and following. And so all these great reforms, the renewal of the covenant, the will not neglect the house of God, all the leaders signing their name to that covenant in chapter 10, all that's happening. But Nehemiah was there. He was hands-on. He was leading by example. He was leading in terms of being there to make sure things were done. But then he left. And so this question that Zelda answered, when we're starting to, well, Tobiah had a room at the temple? How did that happen? Well, that and some other things that follow make sense because it tells you this happened while Nehemiah was back, because he's still in the employ of King Artaxerxes of Persia. He had just had permission to go here to Jerusalem for this designated time, and then he promised to be back. So he was back there in Persia when these things happened in chapter 13. But now he's back and having again to make some correction. All right. So you have to turn your page over now, and we go to number 23. And yeah, go ahead, please. Incidentally, Nehemiah did not call a committee to look into this and to discuss this and get some input on what needed to be done. I'm telling you, stuff was flying. He was getting it out of there. And he said, let's cleanse this place and get it back for its intended purpose. Number 24 is next.
What did happen concerning the Levites in the time? Their portion had not been given in Nehemiah's reign.
Yeah, you know, the question in the next verse number 11 is, why is the house of God forsaken? We mentioned time before last, like I say, we had a meeting last week with Brother Brand, but time before last, we mentioned that there was shall we say, specificity. 3 areas. When in chapter 10 they're renewing their covenant with the Lord. And so they say in a general way, we're going to keep all the precepts in the law of Moses. We're going to obey God. Well, that's good. What does that mean? There were 3 things that they specified. I mean, it means a lot. It means everything that God has said. But they said, we're not going to marry these pagan women. Why do they say that? Well, that's what had caused so much of the trouble. Ezra had to deal with that before. We won't marry pagan women. We'll honor God in our home. Number 2, in our business, we'll observe the Sabbath day. We will do that. We'll keep the Sabbath as God says. Number 3, and there were several verses about this, we won't neglect the house of our God. That means we're going to give the tithe to the Levites. That means we'll provide for the sacrifices, for the wood, everything that's needed. We won't neglect the house of God. So 3 things. In our home, regarding marriage, the Sabbath day regarding business, and regarding worship in the temple, we won't neglect the house of our God. And those 3 things that they promised and covenanted themselves to do before God, that's exactly the 3 things that have to be dealt with in this chapter. Good resolves, great resolves of heart. I'm going to do better. I'm going to do this. I know this is right. I've got to do it. Don't mean a lot if you don't follow through. The follow through is important. I mean, the follow through is essential. It's great to come to a state of mind. You realize I've got to do better. I've got to do thus and so. But if you don't day to day, when nobody's looking, day to day just follow through and do what you're supposed to do, all the talk, all the great resolves of heart won't make up for the lack of follow through. Does that make sense? So you see in chapter 13, we see what happens when there's a vacuum of leadership. There was a high priest, there were Levites, but there wasn't someone there doing what Nehemiah had been doing. And in the absence of that kind of leadership, things had lapsed back into some of the very problems that had been dealt with before. And I'll tell you, that's a lesson about Satan. The devil doesn't have to invent new things. Generation after generation, he can just brush something off a little bit and dress it up a little bit. And the same thing that's been successful time after time, he can use that again. That's what he's doing with these folks. He'd gotten them to sin in these specific areas. A little time went by, and they're tempted again. Okay, so we'll just bear that in mind, because next we're looking here at the matter of the Sabbath. Number 25 is next.
What was taking place on the Sabbath? What did Nehemiah command to do? Buying and selling on the Sabbath, working on the Sabbath, buying bread, and were loading animals with goods to bring them into the city to be sold. Nehemiah commanded the gates of the city be shut on the Sabbath, not allowed around.
Okay, good. That's a good summary, Stan. So it's a little bit, it's not exactly in the same order as chapter 10, but it's still the same points. The last thing in chapter 10 is we're not going to neglect the house of God. Well, that's the first thing that's dealt with here. When you get down to these verses, after it talks in chapter 6 about Nehemiah being gone, but now he's back, verse 6. And so the first thing is the house of God is forsaken, the Levites, the tithes, that sort of thing. Second thing is the Sabbath. And follow up regarding the Sabbath. Look at number 20, question number 26. Now the Bible talks about laying on of hands in a lot of ways. You know, there's the laying on of hands with prayer, the laying on of hands to appoint elders. Nehemiah isn't talking about laying on hands to appoint any elders. He's saying, I'm going to get physical with you. By the way, I skipped a space between my 2 and 1 on 21. Did you notice that? Cheryl, did you notice that? Why is it I always see stuff like that after it's printed and you have it there and the whole world sees it? Number 27 is next. Now this is the third thing here. Temple's been neglected. We've got to fix that again. Sabbath is not being observed. We've dealt with that. Now here's the third thing that we also encounter. And again, relate this to the 10th chapter in your mind and in your study. Number 27 is next. You know, that's pretty powerful. It really mattered to Nehemiah. Ezra, in Ezra chapter 9, when he saw that the covenant people of God had married pagan women, he sat down appalled and he plucked out his beard. And his sorrow so impressed the people that they came to him and said, well, there's still hope here. We want to repent. And so he was very effective. Nehemiah has a different personality. He doesn't pull out the hair of his beard. He pulls out their hair. And that's what the text says. And it says he struck some of them and pulled out their hair. When it says he cursed them, again, this is the curse for disobedience that this is talking about. You know, like, remember Leviticus 26, Deuteronomy 28, you're blessed if you obey, the curses if you disobey. That's what he's talking about, that the curses of the law for disobedience will come upon you. And I can just see some people critiquing Nehemiah when he is taking such drastic measures to correct things. And you can see from Nehemiah's standpoint, they've already been through this. The leaders have covenanted themselves, and the rest of the people as well. They renewed their covenant, and here they are doing this again. And so you can see with the straight talk verbally, the prophetic, the curse for disobedience, striking some of them, pulling their hair. I can just see somebody saying, well, I'll tell you, something should have been done, but Nehemiah went about it the wrong way. You ever heard that? I've heard that sometimes when a point is reached that biblical principles regarding church discipline have been carried out. To carefully follow what God has said in some cases about church discipline. I don't mean I run into this a lot, but I've known of cases where people have said, well, something should have been done, but they went about it the wrong way.
God didn't seem unhappy with what he did.
No, that's right. There's no condemnation there. That's right. A good point. And what I've noticed is the ones that are sometimes saying that, they don't show you the right way. They don't show you another way. And they sit back and do nothing till it's done, and then they criticize the ones that do what should be done. Now, I'm not saying that's happened here at Hanceville, but it's a case to take note so that we won't ever partake of that spirit. An ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure. And so if we have the right attitude all along, we don't have to take those drastic measures. Okay, so, and I can just see the point in verse 26. Did not Solomon, king of Israel, sin by these things? I sometimes wonder, is it appropriate to ask when someone says, well, I'm so strong. Yeah, I know about that, but now this won't impact me. I'll teach him, or I'll change that. I see that, but that's okay. I sometimes want to say, so do you think you're wiser than Solomon? Here's the wisest man in all the earth, and Nehemiah is saying he fell. He fell because he violated what God said in this regard about the home. Well, that brings us to the end. That's number 28. Who's got number 28? Okay. So,
I'm sorry. You're talking about critiquing Nehemiah, and I just saw this quote last week, and it sort of comes in. I think Theodore Roosevelt said it. It's not the critic who counts, not the man who points out how the strong man stumbles, or where the doer of deeds could have done better. The credit goes to the man who is actually in your reach.
there you go. That's a good one. I like that. I've used that. That's a good one. One thing I want to point out in this 29th verse is not just this prayer regarding Nehemiah's referencing these who have sinned, but have we not seen throughout the book of Nehemiah in our study, from beginning to end, that Nehemiah is a man of prayer? That all the way through, before he even makes his request to King Artaxerxes, he's praying about this. And all the way through, when there is opposition and he runs into trouble, I mean, he'll take the necessary measures for precaution, for protection, those kind of things, but you see him repeatedly praying throughout. So Nehemiah is a man of prayer. And this book is about Nehemiah's God and what God was able to do. And it's not what Nehemiah could do or what the children of Israel could do, but it's what the God of Israel did through them, because, as chapter 4 and verse 6 says, the people had a mind to work. So you've got good leadership, you've got the people responding, but throughout there's prayer from beginning to end, and I think it's significant to notice that the book ends with a word of prayer here in verse 29. Well, so we bid farewell to Nehemiah for now. Any questions before we continue? All we lacked this morning was just answering the questions. We've covered the book. Anybody have a question or comment? Anybody? I know in an auditorium class like this, we've got people at different levels. Sometimes we have people that are brand new converts and have never studied in their background this before. Some have studied it, maybe just a survey. Many have not studied it to go through like we have just gone through it. But wherever you were before we started, I hope that this book is more meaningful to you. Having gone through the book, I hope that you have been strengthened by it. It really is a great book. Yes, sir.
Can you help us pin down how to date the end of this order to Malachi, and where we go to kind of solidify that date?
Yes, as far as dates involved in Nehemiah, chronology involved in Nehemiah, Nehemiah is the third of the three returns. I would start there, Aaron. I would say first return under Ezra is the year 536. The second return under Nehemiah is, under Ezra is 458, and then under Nehemiah 444. So where we start here in Nehemiah is 444, and you see there in the second chapter in verse 1 makes reference to the 20th year of King Artaxerxes. Now Artaxerxes reigned from 464 to 423. So this is a Persian king. So it's the 20th year of his reign. That puts the beginning of this book at 444 BC. But in our chapter that we've just reviewed in chapter 13, it mentions in verse 6, but during all this, when it talks about these setbacks now in chapter 13, he says, I was not in Jerusalem, for in the 32nd year of King Artaxerxes. So the 32nd year is when he went back. Now that's going to be 433-432. That's going to be the 32nd year of King Artaxerxes. But he says that's when he went to Persia. However, what happens is, during his absence, these things have taken place. He doesn't give the year that he came back, but he tells about the events that can help us add some time, because the events include their marrying these women that were not Israelites, pagan women. And not only that, but drop on down there, that's in verse 23. And you drop on down there to verse 24, and what does it say there?
Children spoke the language of Ashdod.
Right. Half their children spoke the language of Ashdod, could not speak the language of Israel, spoke according to the language of one or the other. Now, he's not talking about something that's already been dealt with earlier. He's talking about, I was gone. Then when I came back, here's what had happened. So he had been gone long enough for some Israelites to marry pagans and for those marriages to result in children and the children to be old enough to be talking. Now, I know all that can happen pretty quickly. You could be married and have a child within the first year of your marriage. I mean, that happens a lot of times. And then you could have a child that a year old, 18 months, is talking. You know how that works. You spend the first 3 years trying to get them to talk, and the rest of their lives trying to get them to be quiet. But they're talking by the time they're 2 or 3. He's not saying they were teenagers. He was saying that they were old enough to talk, and he's listening to them, and they're not. Half of them are not even speaking the Hebrew language. So when he came back, Aaron, it was enough after this 433, 432. You have to figure, 3 or 4 years minimum. It could have been more, but at least let's say 429 minimum that he came back. Now, as far as Malachi is going to be contemporary. He's the last of the prophets, and he's contemporary with Nehemiah. And conservative scholarships dates him about the year 432, 430, right along in there. That's interesting, because Nehemiah will deal with a lot of lackadaisical kinds of attitudes, where you're offering things that are not really, they're blemished, and you're withholding the tithe. Will a man rob God? Yet you rob me. And so you see Malachi is going to deal with some of these same things as a prophet that Nehemiah had to deal with when he came back as well.
Textually, how we place Malachi right there in the context of the tribes fit. But is there a text where it says these years?
No, Malachi does not use a date to date himself by a king. I'm talking about the consensus of scholarship, conservative scholarship on that point. But
I was kind of thinking how Haggai and Zechariah, so these are the five.
well, yeah. But and most of the kings, many of the kings do that. Malachi does not. But he's the last one, and as I say, there's with a combination of things, but not dating a king. But he's about 432, 430 BC. But it's going to really be this same time period where Nehemiah has left and gone back to Persia, where this happens. You see, where Malachi is speaking and doing his work. You're welcome anytime, Greg.
You mentioned before, we've studied before back in Kings about how close the promises of God, specifically the lineage that Christ would come through, would hung by a thread, and maybe one survivor of that lineage, so close to being wiped out. And in this particular situation, as you read it in Nehemiah, specifically the 13th chapter, they came so close again.
That's true.
In a different way.
That's such a good point.
God's promises about Christ within them.
Very good point. And yet through it all, God was with them and saw to it that the unfolding of his plan would continue.
And Ezra and Nehemiah impresses me about how much the providence of God is emphasized. Because there's not, if I remember correctly, there aren't any miraculous events.
Correct. That's correct. Raymond, I saw your hand up.
I think the last sentence of the chapter is important enough to mention.
Yeah, thank you, Raymond. And there's where you have the final prayer. Remember me, oh my God, for good. And we didn't call attention to that. So the very last expression is in the form of a prayer. We emphasize 29, but not 31. Thank you for that.
I think that should be something each of us should be.
Yeah, when you want to improve in your prayer life, improve in your prayers to God, there's no better way to do that than look at prayers in the Bible and to incorporate that. And there's a lot of scripture that can help us in prayer. And sometimes specifically prayers themselves, you can make that your own. And this is sure a good one. Wouldn't you agree, Raymond? That's a good one to do that with. Appreciate those good comments. And now we're ready for the book of Esther. Greg, if I may, I think I want to, you kind of set this up. It'd be a shame for me not to kind of tag on to what you just said. In 2 Chronicles 21, this is where the son of Jehoshaphat, whose name was Jehoram, took the throne. He was married to wicked Athaliah. And the first thing he does when he takes the throne in 2 Chronicles 21, he's the descendant of David. This is the royal seed. He's the one, it turns out Christ will come through him. But the first thing he did was to kill all of his brothers. Well, then when he is reigning, what happens in the first part of 2 Chronicles 22 is that there's a group of raiders that came through, and they killed all of Jehoram's sons. Every one of them, except one. And his name was Ahaziah. And so he reigns. He's the youngest. He's the only one left. So, Greg, that's 2 generations now. With Jehoram, that's by his own doing. He's the one that he killed all of his brothers. But that wiped out the royal seed except for him. Well, then the raiders came through, and all of his sons, so that next generation, they're all killed except Ahaziah. Well, in the year 841 BC, do you remember that Jehu, by God's command, was to kill the Baal worshipers? That included the house of Ahab, but because Ahaziah was connected by marriage, kin that way, he also was fair game, and so Jehu killed both Jehoram and Ahaziah in the year 841 BC. Well, the first thing that happens then in Judah is that wicked Athaliah, Ahaziah's mother, killed every one of Ahaziah's sons, and she got on the throne. She killed every one of them except baby Joash, 1 year old. And Jehoiada, the priest, and his wife Jehoshaphat saved the baby and kept him hidden for 6 years. And then he'll be put on the throne, and the reign will continue. But Greg, when you look at it that way, there are 3 successive generations where the messianic hope is hanging just by a thread. And yet God saw to it that the promise continued. Now, why do we say that? Well, as Greg was indicating, first we need to note that in the history that we've just covered, in the history of the divided kingdom. But when it comes to the book of Esther, what we have here is not just someone wanting to kill the king's household. It's going to turn out that here we have the man who is next to the king, Haman, next to Xerxes, the most powerful man on earth, and he obtains permission. He has the signet ring and everything to kill all the Jews throughout the empire. And it's not like, well, boy, that would be bad. That'd be like the Holocaust. I mean, well, the thing is, it would be bad, but it would bring to an end the messianic hope. And so that really is what we're faced with here in this book. So we want to go into it seeing that it is a book to show, but it's not the first time, but it's to show how God intervenes for His glory, for His name's sake, so that what He had promised and purposed in His mind before the world began, and what He had been promising since Genesis 3:15, that it would come to pass in spite of Satan's opposition down through the ages. And so now we come to the book of Esther. So let's do just a little bit of orientation here. I have for you chapter content and questions on the first 3 chapters on a sheet that will be passed out. So let's see what we can do. We've got another 15 minutes of class time, and let's see what we can do in our study this morning. I forget right now what source, as I was doing some preparation for our study, and it's been a few weeks ago since I was doing this, that I came across a biblical event navigator. I thought that was a neat kind of thing. So many of you who are teaching in other classes, as well as you teach your children, you make use of the Bible periods. And what we want to do is for it to just become second nature to us. That whenever we study any book in the Bible, we see how that fits in the whole of Scripture. So we do that all the time here. And all the classes do it, not just me. Cheryl does that all the time. All of you teachers do that. Ann, do you teach that way? Do you think? I know Linda does. Laurie, do you make use of this? Okay. So here, now these periods are, the wording is a little different than what I've taught our young people in young people's class. You know how it is when you sit on the class. I can ask any of them, say your 16 Bible periods, and they go right through it. But we'll say creation and pre-flood, starting out. Well, they're calling this pre-patriarchal period. Well, I don't care. That's creation and pre-flood, flood and post-flood. That takes you through the time of Noah and brings you to the time of Abraham. And so then the Exodus, the Israelite conquest, the period of the judges. This particular navigator did not include the wilderness wandering. Of course, that fits in right there, that 40-year period. But more recently, what we've covered: United Kingdom, divided kingdom, Israel taken into captivity by the Assyrians, then the period of Judah alone, and so Judah's taken into captivity by Babylon. And so what we have now is the period of return, the return and rebuilding period. So it's important to notice the Persians are reigning over the Jews. 3 returns. The first return, the temple is rebuilt, and that is with Zerubbabel. Then Ezra returns, the second return, and then the third return is what we've just studied with Nehemiah. Now the story of Esther is actually going to fit in between the first return and the second return, closer to the second return. But anyway, what we have looked at, and Cheryl, I was checking this morning, we still have copies of this sheet. If anyone does not have a copy of the Persian Kings, what we've been looking at is Artaxerxes. But what we have to do chronologically, Aaron, to get the chronology here, to study Ezra, we're going to back up in time. Now it's the next book in the Bible. Ezra, Nehemiah, Esther. So Esther is the next book in the Bible. But chronologically, we're backing up. It's before the time of Nehemiah. And so, in fact, it's going to be like it's positioned right here. This is Ezra 6, and this is Ezra 7. And so the chart is positioning this exactly right, that the story of Esther, Ahasuerus, or Xerxes, you've got the Persian name, you've got the Hebrew name. This occurs after chapter 6, but before chapter 7, if you wanted to see where does it occur in Ezra. Then you've got the events of Ezra coming after Esther, that is Ezra's return in 7 through 10. The events of Nehemiah also came after Esther. Here we have some dates, Aaron, that are very helpful to us, because it's going to tell you, we're going to look at when he begins his reign. Xerxes begins his reign in 486, and it's in the 3rd year of his reign. Chapter 1 starts where he's having this banquet and having all these leaders over of 127 provinces. And he's doing this for 6 months. Banquet. And then there's a special 1-week festival, where Vashti, you come out and show your beauty. Well, that takes place because we know it's the 3rd year of his reign, that's going to be in 483 BC. But over here to the map, what he's going to do is to invade Greece, and they're going to be defeated in 480 and 479. Well, then when you get to chapter 2, it's going to say in the 7th year of his reign, this is when he marries Esther. That's after his return from these battles where he's defeated. And so that's when Esther becomes his queen in the year 479. We'll look at all that as we go. And it mentions here Herodotus. Are you familiar with Herodotus, the historian? I'll tell you what, that's really fascinating. And in his work, in the works of Herodotus, there are 9 books, and he devotes books 7, 8, and 9 to the period in the Bible that we're talking about right here. It is fascinating, really fascinating. And here again, if we're in another setting and had more time. But he is mentioned here because he is such a great source historically. This is one of those cases where history is intersecting with the biblical story. And so he's telling you, see, we might not know, why is he having all those people over? Is he just a generous person? No. He's getting ready to invade Greece. And he's wanting to gather support. He's providing a banquet. He's talking it up. You know, here's what we need to do, and you can be part of this. And so, see, Herodotus is telling us the why of what we just read about in Esther that's just mentioned as the what, the fact that he did that. So again, we're going to be looking at the father of Artaxerxes. We're backing up. So Darius is the one. He gives permission for the temple to be completed. Remember, in the days of Haggai and Zechariah, after the progress had stopped there initially, earlier. And so we've been talking about this Persian king. Nehemiah was cupbearer for this man, but this is his father, Xerxes. And so here's another chart that I came across. This one is by Jensen. I really like his material. I know the print is small, but that doesn't matter. What he's showing you here is how you place the book of Esther and Xerxes. He's showing you how you place this between the end of Ezra 6 and the beginning of Ezra 7. And so it's before the second return under Ezra that this takes place here. So I find that helpful. Here's a chart that we have used throughout this period here, because we can see how that the Israelites from the return, after all, we saw in the book of Ezra that it's only about 50,000 that came back. The prophets kept using that R word in describing who would return. What is it that would return? It's a remnant that would return. Just a remnant. The rest of the people did not return. And so a remnant returned. They built the temple. It's not as big as Solomon's temple. And they're being harassed by enemies all the time that seem to have the upper hand. Things don't seem to be going right. They have a kind of a defeatist attitude. And the prophet Jeremiah steps in. God intervenes. God speaks. And he says, let me tell you about what I'm accomplishing in this period. This is so significant, what I'm doing with the return of my people, that here's what will happen. The days are coming when it will no longer be said, as the Lord lives who brought Israel out of the land of Egypt. In other words, the Exodus. But as the Lord lives who brought the sons of Israel from the land of the north and the countries where he had banished them, for I will restore them to their own land which I gave to their fathers. And so God himself is saying that what I'm doing with the people at this point will surpass what I've done in the past. That you think the Exodus was great. What I'm going to do with this remnant that returns, as my purpose with them continues, that's going to be even greater still. So what I want to do is take a period that people rarely study. Everybody knows about the Exodus, but few people study proportion, and percentage-wise, fewer people would study the return and rebuilding. We want to see that this is what God said about this. It's very important. And as much as possible when we're studying the Scripture, what are we trying to do? Are we trying to think God's thoughts after him? Are we trying to have his attitude? And we're wanting to look at something like he looks at it. Isn't that right? Okay, so this is going to be a great study.
Leon,
Yes?
it's just interesting in contrast because I guess it's easy to latch on to the greatness of the Exodus.
Yes.
There's such mighty works and miracles, and here's the return from captivity, and there's not a lot of miraculous and mighty works, described here.
Right.
Yet, look at how God describes this.
And God has shown that in a lot of ways. You remember when he took Elijah aside and he showed the great wind that was breaking up everything, and he showed him the earthquake and the fire, and the point was made God was in none of that, and then it's the still small voice. And It's not always with the 10 dramatic plagues that you see the hand of God. It's not always with the miraculous. And so, I mean, that's a good point. If we can see that it's the day-to-day things, the people that are really the salt of the earth and the light of the world don't just get excited when there's a siren running. They don't just get excited when there's some big thing that occurs. It's the day-to-day, steady, doing what you're supposed to do. God can work with people like that. People just get all fired up about some special event and then it just fizzles out. Not much substance to that. Josh?
To build on that, is there anything less seemingly miraculous than the crucifixion? You know, an event that's bloody and disgusting.
Yeah.
Crucifixions happen probably nearly every day. You know, something seemingly not miraculous, but it's the greatest event in history.
Right, yeah. And yet, that's the focal point of our plan of redemption. It's going to be interesting in the first chapter. God is able, there's another passage we've used, Proverbs 21 and verse 1. Who's got that ready to read for me? Proverbs 21 and verse 1 talks about what God can do to turn the heart of the king. Who's got that for me? Boy, y'all are slow. Becca, you got it? Read it for me.
The king's heart is in the hands of the Lord, like the rivers of water, who turns it wherever he wishes.
So here's the most powerful king on earth. And he doesn't control his temper very well. And he has a lot of pride. And God is able to turn his heart. And so his queen will be deposed, that is Vashti. But it paves the way for Esther to become queen. And we're using the expression for such a time as this. Let me go ahead to that passage that mentions that, where Mordecai is talking to her about this after she's queen and after Haman has come up with this scheme. He says, if you remain silent at this time, relief and deliverance will arise for the Jews from another place, but you and your father's house will perish. Yet who knows whether you've come to the kingdom for such a time as this? So God is going to use her. Now let me back up. We're going to see, again, the threat that is upon the Jews and how the Jews are spared. We're going to, again, to make our way through that. By the way, I did some comparing of other translations. The NET, you've achieved royal status. You have been brought to royal dignity, position. You've been elevated to this place for such a time as this. So geographically, the setting is going to be at Susa, which is the capital, one of the capitals. Actually, Persia had 4 capitals at this time. They made use of Babylon, Ecbatana, Susa, and Persepolis. But the events here are at Susa right there. So again, here are your 1, 2, 3, 4 capitals, but the events here are taking place right there in Susa. Would you like to see some things that came from the capital? Actually, this one came from Persepolis. Our University of Chicago excavated in Persepolis, the capital there, but this was built in the time of Xerxes, as you see right here, the colossal bullhead. And this double-headed column here, that's where the beam would go for the great audience hall, the double bull capital, and another column capital in the form of a man bull, you see. So again, in the days of Xerxes. So these are some things actually taken from the palace of the man we're studying about, which I think is quite remarkable. So here's what we've got in the chapter. We're going to pass out our chapter content in just a moment. Queen Vashti will be dethroned. Esther will become queen. Haman's plot to destroy the Jews. And then Esther is convinced by Mordecai to help. And so the king is going to honor Mordecai. Haman is hanged, and Haman's letters are reversed, revoked, and the Jews defeat their enemies. And chapter 10 just has about 3 verses where you see Mordecai's advancement. So it's going to be a great study. I have here chapter content, a summary.